Hello. Welcome on back to my channel. I hope y'all are doing well. Today we're going to mix it up and try something different. I'm going to give a really thorough walkthrough on how to master the art of baking. It's an extremely popular technique that's been around for many of years that I love using and that you see me use quite often on my clients and in my tutorials. So without further ado, let's get started. So to begin, it's only fair that we start from the very beginning, which is concealer. I have foundation on, of course, but I completely wiped off my under eye area, so you can see how I apply the concealer before we add on powder. The base concealer I'm using is from Elizabeth Arden. It's called their Flawless Finish Skin Caring Concealer. I find this to be extremely hydrating, which is great for the technique we're using today, and it's closer to my skin tone, but we're going to be brightening it up here in a second with another concealer. I bring it right up to the under eye area and then fade it out towards the highest point of the cheekbone, and this will give us a little lift. This is something I've more recently been using. I think this is a great concealer for just about anybody because, as I said, it is hydrating, but it's also fuller in coverage, which is more my style. You see how that does a really nice job at concealing those darker tones I have around my eyes. Now to brighten this, I'm going to use this Maybelline Instant Rewind Eraser. This is actually a color corrector. It's in the shade 160, and I like popping this right here in the inner corner, which will give us a nice brightness. It doesn't have to be an obscene amount of product, just a little bit right there in the inner corner to give it a little lift. So now that we have this blended out, we're going to set it into place with a very small amount of powder. This is not something that you necessarily want to take your time on. You want to get right in there and set it so that way the liquid or cream concealer you're using isn't creasing up in any fine lines. If you find there is any creasing happening, you'll want to grab your sponge real quick and blend it out before using any powder, because once you use powder, you are locking that concealer into place in the position that you're using the powder on. So now I'm taking just a little bit of translucent setting powder. I'm using the Lower Mercier setting powder. I'll link everything down below. And I'm pressing this into the under eye area. Now we're not going straight in with the baking technique. And if you had a chance to see the TikTok I created a little while back that I called my blend set bake technique, it kind of goes back to all this. So we blend out the concealer. The idea is that we then set it with the smallest amount of translucent setting powder just to set it into place. And then we go in with the baking technique. The reason I like to set it with a little bit of powder first is because it locks in that concealer. And if I find that the concealer is too wet when going straight into the baking technique with loads of powder, it feels too heavy because the concealer being wet just soaks up that powder so quickly. But this just kind of lays down the groundwork for the next steps we use. Also, something that I find important to mention here is that if you're using a powder to bake with or to set your under eye with that has a pigment to it, so meaning it's not completely translucent, it has a yellow or a pink or a lavender undertone to it, I find that if you apply that straight onto a wet surface, it kind of soaks up that pigment, which leaves your under eye, darker rather than lighter. So that's something important to consider when you're choosing a powder. So we have the concealer blended out, we have it completely set into place. So now we're going to go into the baking technique, which is what we've all been waiting for. To do this, I'm going to be using this powder from Benai. It's in the shade Fair. They have some fantastic powders if you're looking for some. It's more of a pro makeup artistry brand, but it's accessible. You can get it online. But I'm going to pour some into the palm of my hand. You see that? And then I'm going to grab a powder puff, press the powder puff into the powder, and then onto my under eye area. You'll notice that I'm not using swiping motions. I'm pressing this into the skin, keeping most of the pigment right here in my upper inner corner of my cheek underneath my eye. And I like bringing it down towards the side of my contour on my nose because it'll give the nose contour some contrast, which will give it a more defined look. And then I also like to bring it up onto my upper cheek, keeping it right below the winged eyeliner I created. So what is the purpose of baking? It depends on who you ask, right? This is not a technique I created or anything. Like, this has been around for years, primarily for stage makeup. And what it does, I find at least on myself or on my clients, is a few different things. One, it extends the longevity of the makeup because it's literally baking powder into the complexion products, into the concealer, foundation, or even your skincare. But on that note, it's worth mentioning that if you have dry skin, or if you don't use much concealer or foundation, you keep it extremely light, then the lighter amount of powder you're going to want to go for. Or you may just not even enjoy this technique because the powder here is really relying on moisture for it to work, for it to bake into the skin. If it's not getting that moisture from your concealer, or if it's not getting it from your foundation, then it's going to be pulling that moisture from your skin, therefore leaving your skin feeling extremely dry because it's pulling that hydration out. I will go as far as to say that when I use this technique on clients, I have to take into account the amount of concealer I'm using. I need to use a bit more concealer than I usually would because the powder is pulling out that moisture. It's almost kind of like baking, literally. Like when you're baking a cake, the recipe calls for some kind of, liquid, whether it be oil, milk, water, I don't know, whatever the recipe calls for. If you don't put enough of it in, it's gonna come out the oven looking crazy. So that's kind of a silly example, but that's how I look at it, and I hope that helps. Now, as for the powder puff, this is the way to go. You can pick these up for like a couple of dollars. You don't have to spend a fortune on it. As for the powder that you use here, you wanna use something that's finely milled and that works for your skin tone. Personally, I do not like anything that has shimmer in it. Shimmer, I find, accentuates any fine lines and pores around this area of the skin, and you want to consider the undertone of the powder. That's why I like going for something like this shade, because it'll brighten the under eye. It has a bit of a pink undertone pigment to it, which will complement the concealer we used. If you have a deeper skin tone, you'll want to stick to something that has more of a yellow, golden, peachy undertone, whereas if you have a fair skin tone, you'll want to stick to something that has more of a pink, rose undertone to it. How long you leave this on for is really dependent on your skin type. I personally like to leave this on while I do my eye makeup, so for about 15 or 20 minutes. I find that to be the sweet spot for me. On my clients who have a drier skin type, I might leave this on for only a couple of minutes, while those who have extremely oily skin can get away with leaving this on for as long as, I don't know, 30 minutes to an hour. It just depends on you. You kind of have to play around with it and see what works for you. But the longer you leave it on for, the more it's going to soak into the skin. Besides the under eye area, you can also bake in different areas of the face. So I also like to bake along the jawline. And I find that this just adds a little extra definition to the hollows of my cheeks here by giving contrast to the contour. Usually for the jawline, I like to go in with something that has a bit more of a golden yellow undertone when it comes to my skin tone, because it's a bit more complementary to the rest of my complexion. But you see what that does there? And when we wipe this away in a few minutes, it'll leave a beautiful contrast behind. Another benefit I see from using this technique is that when I have this underneath my eyes while I do my eye makeup, it catches any of the fallout that we may get from the powder eyeshadows. And furthermore, which is probably the biggest benefit I see from this, is that because this is completely set into place and it's nowhere near like wet, I do not experience any smudging from my mascara on my bottom lashes throughout the day. All right, if you are into a full coverage under eye, this is not for the faint of heart. I'm gonna take a powder foundation, and with a fluffy face brush, I'm going to press that into the pigment and use this to wipe off the baking powder. Watch this. Little by little, I'm gonna dust away that powder. If I need a bit more precision, I will pinch the brush and sweep it up underneath the under eye. Of course, this isn't, required, but I do like the extra coverage I get when I use a powder foundation in combination with a setting powder to wipe it away. So it gives a really beautiful result. You see what that does to the under eye? Like, it doesn't look, even in person, I'll tell you, it doesn't look cakey. It doesn't look dry. It looks extremely smooth, which is exactly what I use this technique for. Doesn't that look real? I mean, if we go back to the beginning of the video and see the before shot where I had a lot of the bluish, purple undertones around my under eye, now it looks extremely smooth. It looks brightened, but without looking cakey. I'm going to use the same method by taking this brush of foundation powder and sweep off the jawline baking. It doesn't leave behind a striking highlight. It's very subtle and understated. It's at this point that I'll go in with my powder blushes and highlights. So I'm going to use this pinky tone blush and pop this right on and put it right in between where my bronzer is and the highlight where we have placed the baking powder. And this meshes the two together to make sure there's a seamless transition. Boy, that was a mouthful. It's at this point that I'll take a moment to finish off my eyeshadow on the lower lash line and do any finishing touches. But I want to take a second to say that I do see on TikTok and people commenting saying that they've tried this technique and it just doesn't work for them. What am I doing wrong, Spencer? And I don't want anyone to feel that way. Like, it may not be that you're doing something wrong. It may just be that it's not the right technique for you. It's not going to be for everybody, but the best you can do is play around with it and experiment and see how it does. Even though I think this looks really good on camera and in person, this is not something I would necessarily do every single day, especially for a no makeup look. Like, if I was just looking to run out the door and run some errands, would I be baking? Probably not. It's definitely more appropriate for a fuller coverage style of makeup. I can't sit here and say that it doesn't feel like I'm wearing makeup. It most definitely feels like I'm wearing powder underneath my eyes. And, in my opinion, it's worth it because I like the result. And there we have it, kids. I hope you enjoyed today's tutorial. I try to be as thorough as possible, but if you have any questions, please let me know down below in the comments. If you want to see more tutorials like this, where I get more into depth on particular steps in the makeup routine, please also let me know and I can get to working on that. Don't forget to give this video a big ol' thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. You can also check out more of my work on my Instagram at Painted by Spencer. And until next time, I'll see you soon.